quickly take you through some specific elements and concepts and definitions that we're going to be working with this week in particular, and just a couple of tips, if you will, on working with the online electronic literature readings. Our focus for this week is interactivity in new media. And the posting for this week is going to ask you to kind of apply that concept and think about it with respect to our readings. We have two readings, or two groups of readings this week. One is a short excerpt from Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And in a minute I'll explain excuse me, why I think it's important that we're working with that text, even though you might say, well, you know, comics are not necessarily a new form of media, and that's true, but they exhibit some elements and some aspects of reading and interaction that will be helpful to us in terms of the work that we are doing with new media texts, in particular new media or digital literature this week. All right. So that's the first reading, is Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, a section from that I'm going to offer a very brief overview of in just a moment here. And then we'll be moving into some samples or examples from the electronic literature collection. And those are going to require a little bit of sort of understanding or innovation in terms of how you think about them as text to read. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a bit. Okay, so there's two objectives this week. The first is to understand how new media environments use text and images to convey meaning. In other words, one of the things that we're going to really be concentrating on, and this is a really important concept for the digital age at this moment, is the way in which new media or online or digital text, and by text we mean anything from the literature that we read to the textbooks that you read on your Kindle to the newspaper that you now read online, how they bring together images and words or language to convey meaning. And to that end, we're going to develop a concept of something that is incredibly central to an understanding of digital culture and new media, the concept of interactivity. So those are the kinds of the two things that we're going to be looking at this week. You have this video to work from, but you also have the readings, and you have a copy of this presentation itself for you to download and go back over as you need to refamiliarize yourself with it. Okay, in time frames, Scott McCloud, from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which we're reading this week, Scott McCloud is particularly interested in talking about how comics or graphic novels, if you've read graphic novels, this applies to them as well, how they convey a story or how they transmit meaning in the comic environment. And in particular, he's interested in how spatial environments, and that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about space when we're talking about a comic, because how you position things on the page, how you read from up and down or left to right, or how you look at images in relationship to words, really play a key role in how you understand what that text has to convey to you. Right? So this is an important kind of frame of reference for us, because it's going to help us understand a little bit more clearly how we read in digital environments, or how we read in new media environments. And this is so important for us at this moment because it's changing so radically. And we'll talk about this as we go through the course, the science and some of the studies that have been done on how we are reading differently, of how we extract information differently from these environments. But McCloud gives us kind of a beginning sort of foothold, if you will, in terms of thinking about how meaning is conveyed in environments that use both images and text, and also rely on spatial layout, right? So I hope you're able to read through and sort of, I think that the McCloud piece is pretty easy to understand. He uses the comic environment to actually make his arguments, and I think it's a very effective way of doing so. If you have questions as you go through this, you should be in touch with me. And as you'll see, as we get further into the class, we're going to start to have some opportunities to kind of chat online, not necessarily simultaneously, though we could go that route if we needed to, but you'll have the opportunity to post questions and have conversations with each other. You'll be getting an email from me where I'll be talking about how I'm going to ask you once a week to just offer some observations or commentary on another's post. And so, one of the things that, we're really sort of going to be focused on, in addition to just working through the content, is finding some other ways to have discussions or to work through concepts. The McCloud is a pretty accessible reading, and you should be really focusing on what he's trying to say about how comics convey meaning in their particular environment. One thing that McCloud really focuses on is the gutter, okay, the gutter between panels in comics. Here's an example right here, right? And this is a perfect example of how images and text come together in a very different way and how reading operates differently in a comics environment. And in this example that we have on the screen right here, you can see that we've got this like sort of chaotic scene happening where something's about to happen to someone. We can see by the expression in the face and the action behind and the implied sort of protection of the hands of something coming in from the side here. And then there's a gutter, and then we hear this scream on the other side. Now what McCloud really points to in time frames is the way in which we're able to fill in sort of what happened here. We don't get the vivid literal example of this poor guy's fate here, whether he's about to be munched by a monster or another superhero. But we're able to understand that when we see the scream on the other side, something pretty bad happened to this guy. And what we do is we fill in imaginatively between the two literal images, right? And this process is called closure. So closure is literally, closure is literally the completion of the missing meaning of something. For instance, imagining that another side of an object exists when only one side is visible. So it's something that we do with our brains. Our perception is that we fill in the comic environment. We use that gutter space to actually sort of complete the idea from one image to the next, right? And so what really McCloud is pointing to here is the way in which our own brains, our own kind of perceptual apparatus sort of participates in this environment to sort of make meaning within that framework. And this is a little bit different than just reading text on a page, right? Text on a page, you're taking words and you're creating an image, or you're imaginatively sort of producing what the words are trying to convey to you. But in comics, because they work with both images and text, there's a way in which you actually participate a little bit more in creating some of the content or some of the meaning, right? And closure is, in McCloud, in time frames, this ability of seeing the part of something or just a piece of something, but being able to perceive the whole. Because the way in which the images and the text and the spatial layout of the comics allow for that to take place. So we're going to move in now to the second objective from that example that I just discussed in the reading from McCloud, to create a definition of interactive reading. And this is going to be so crucial to the work that we're going to do in this class, this idea of interactivity. So closure in comics, as McCloud discusses, is actually an example of interactive reading. And what that means is interactivity, or an interactive test, requires participation or contribution from the reader or viewer. And from last week, you can remember from some of the videos that we watched about YouTube and that kind of thing, that this type of reading is really important because it's not just passive reading anymore. It's not just taking in content that someone else has created for you. You, as a reader or viewer, are actively engaged in producing the text as well. Interactivity requires your active participation or your active contribution as a reader in producing the text. So in an interesting way, you're actually writing at the same time that you're reading. And this is something that's very distinctive about digital environments and new media objects, texts, and platforms. So let's work now with a definition. And I urge you to download this and come back to this and use this as a resource and it will help you with your posting. Interactivity involves the actions or input of a user, and especially relating to two-way electronic communication system. So interactivity in the way that we're thinking about it means that there is an action or an input from the user that participates in the reading or writing experience, right? And this is super crucial for us as we move forward and work with these particular digital text and new media environments. Okay. Notice, I'll just draw your attention to the fact when we talk about input or we talk about communication, we're not just talking about active input as in clicking on a hyperlink, but as Scott McCloud points out in time frames, that kind of input can come from your mental or perceptual apparatus as well. In other words, filling in content based on your interaction with a particular unusual or innovative layout of space, text, and image. Okay, and by contrast or example, I just want to point out an example of a reading or viewing experience that is not interactive, and television is an example of a reading or viewing experience that is very passive. You notice when we sit down to watch television by ourselves or with our family or friends, you're pretty much in kind of a passive receiving mode. You watch and the content is provided for you, right? And this is in contrast to what we're trying to explore here, which is a more interactive way of reading or viewing. So television, example of something that's very non-interactive and a more passive viewing experience. Okay, so what I want you to be thinking about this week is, as you read through the electronic literature collection, how do the readings from this week allow for various forms of interactivity in how you read the works? And read is in quotes here because these works are going to ask you to do different kinds of reading activities. You're not just going to be staring at the screen. You're going to have to click things. You're going to have to explore different paths through a particular text. The instructions for each of the works are pretty straightforward, so you should be able to get a sense of sort of experimenting and playing with how to work through and read those individual texts. But I'm always available if you have particular questions or problems that come up. Okay, but this is the question you want to have before you as you work through the links and readings for this week. Finally, there is an option available on this little video if you want to download this presentation and click on this right number link here. You can see a little bit more.